Adolf Augustus Berle is an interesting character. He was a liberal at a time when the term liberal was slightly less abusive than it is used today, but was still not considered to be a pleasant way of describing anyone. The implication was that he was someone who represented a view that was not truly American, and perhaps stood a little bit outside the norm, and his personal life and immoral behaviour might back this up. Interestingly, another pro-capitalist but anti-status quo economist, Keynes, had a similar sex, drugs and rock and roll reputation. He was actually an American diplomat with a pro-US imperialist reputation in Central America. He became a professor of corporate law at Columbia Law School in 1927 and remained on the faculty until he retired in 1964. And as we will see, during the FDR administration, Berle worked on the New Deal policy and the Good Neighbour policy. So, what was it that he was talking about? As a university professor, he was an author, he was a US diplomat, he was a part of the liberal establishment of the time, and as I noted, he was professor of corporate law at Columbia. So he kind of predates Chandler, which I have another lecture on Chandler, which was recorded, and I hope you'll watch. And he was just coming to the end of his career when Chandler was just about starting out, though they did overlap a little bit. He had a number of publications, and one of the most important was The Modern Corporation and Private Policy, in which he'd worked on with Gardner Means. In that, he stated that by 1928, stockholders numbered 18 million, up from 4.4 million in 1900. Though in theory stockholders owned a company, they were too numerous to exercise any control over management. Executives essentially ran companies as they saw fit. Stockholders couldn't provide the oversight of non-owners managers to see that they maximised profit and secured the prosperity of the company for their benefits. Managers, it was feared, would rather seek for themselves the perquisites of power, cushy jobs, great salaries, fancy offices, chauffeur-driven limousines. That separation of ownership and control, Berle and Means wrote, destroys the very foundation on which the economic order of the past 3 centuries has rested. Before writing this book, he was looking at the state of the US in the late 20s and early 30s. As you can imagine, it's a time of major economics problems, so let's have a brief look at its history. Other books he wrote, of course, The 20th Century Capitalist Revolution, The Power Without Property, Latin America Diplomacy and Reality, proved what he was, something of a Renaissance man, and shows how his many different interests and many different areas he worked and how they could come together. But our main interest is in how he saw governance and responsible management and business should be operating at a time of crisis. So, what was happening in the time of this Wall Street crash? Well, the Roaring Twenties had just finished, the times of the plaffer dancing, excess, people getting overexcited following the end of World War One, and this led to a great time of post-war optimism. However, while that was happening in the cities, many rural Americans migrated to the cities because of this, in the hopes of finding a more prosperous life, but with the ever-growing expansion of America's industrial sector. However, while the American cities themselves prospered, the vast migration from rural areas continued with the neglect of the US agriculture industry would create widespread financial despair among American farmers throughout the decade, and this would later be blamed as one of the key factors that led to the 1929 stock market crash. Despite the danger of speculation, many believed the stock market would continue to rise indefinitely. On March 25th, 1929, however, a mini crash occurred after investors started to sell stocks at a rapid pace, exposing the market's shaky foundation. 2 days later, banker Charles E. Mitchell announced his company, the National City Bank, would provide $25 million in credit to stop the market slide. Mitchell's move brought a temporary halt to the financial crisis, and core money declined from 20 to 8%. However, the American economy was now showing ominous signs of trouble. Steel production was declining, construction was sluggish, car sales were down, and consumers were building up high debts because of easy credit. This may remind you of something that happened much more recently and is still ongoing. The market had been on a 9-year run that saw the Dow Jones Industrial Average increase in value tenfold, peaking at 381.17 on September 3rd, 1929. Shortly before the crash, economist Irving Fisher famously proclaimed, "Stock prices have reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. Never trust a neoliberal economist." The optimism of financial gains of the great bull market was shaken on September 18, 1929, when share price of the New York Stock Exchange, the NYSE, abruptly fell. So how did Berle respond? Although we are discussing theory and he was a great theoretician, I think it's important to remember at a time when we often talk about what was the impact of academics, that he was an active politician working with Franklin Delano Roosevelt, FDR, US President from 1932 until his death in 1945. He supported the Roosevelt administration and pushed for what became known as the New Deal, or the Good Neighbour policy. This was an attempt to boost the economy by investment, what in the UK is known as classical Keynesianism. As I've noticed earlier, there was some relationship between Keynes and Berle in their behaviour. He was not anti-capitalist, let us stress that. He was actually very pro-capitalist, but he believed that it needed to be saved from itself. He wrote on quite a number of subjects, and as we've noted, he talked about the impact of corporations and classical economic theory, and he talked about the modern corporation, about private property, about the 20th century capitalist revolution. He talked about the question, could you have power without property? He was pro-capitalist, remember. He believed in the power of private property. And he was talking about a classic Renaissance man in a lot of things of pie. So he's looking at the rise of the public listed companies. He's looking at the need for a new regulatory regime which protects both share owners and society at large. But one of the things he comes up with is the idea that investors are not investors at all, but speculators. And so he comes to the fore when he's 54. And that is, he's 54 at the time in 1929, when we start to see the early collapse of the stock market, the initial warnings that there's a problem. And this went on to be the greatest stock market collapse in modern history. Remember, at this time, when there's a stock market collapse, there was very little in the way of social welfare. When there was, and so there was no other jobs around. You lost your job, unless you could find another job, you starved. The economics at the time, the neoliberal economics, believed that the price of labour would now fall, i.e. wages would fall to a level at which there would be jobs recreated as people had to pay less, and it would become worth employing people again. The jobs would come back over time. But of course this didn't happen, and it began to be felt that there would be a lot of permanent unemployment. So while Roosevelt was introducing deficit spending in order to boost the economy, Berle's core idea, that was actually quite radical, is he actually looked at the idea of public listed companies that Chandler, my other video, has argued were the driving force of capitalism, and that their structure, the M form, was great, and that private regulation was working. And he said, no, actually, this is a new form of capitalism. In fact, he went beyond this and said, capitalism is actually dead. To him, capitalism died when people stopped running their own businesses. Adam Smith always believed that people would be forever self-employed and just come together to work together because it would be more efficient, but they would remain as their own boss. However, once people started to own shares in companies, they talked about shares being investments, but he argued that shareholders are not investors, shareholders are speculators. He argued that unless you actually put the money when the company is first set up, that's when the money goes to the companies, and it's often used to develop an idea, which is like Dragon's Den seed funding, for instance, and that this may even be true with initial public offerings. But if you don't put the money in at the beginning, you are speculating on the secondary market. So you have a system, there's a secondary market on which you can buy shares, and the money goes to the pocket of the person who owned the shares just before you. It doesn't go to the company, it's not good for investment, so it is not investment as such. In economic terms, Berle said, you are speculating, not investing. So the first people might be investors, but future people who call themselves investors are not investors at all, but speculators. This becomes a real problem. He's saying to people, look, you don't actually contribute to the real economy at all. You are parasites on the real economy. But he also believed that these people were vulnerable. One of the statements that I often believe in saying is that you cannot con an honest man. So speculators themselves, trying to be speculators, were actually right for being ripped off. And this is what he believed caused the Wall Street crash. He believed that actually they required a new regulation, new corporate governance for capitalism, in which both shareholders and society at large were protected. So he's arguing, the first person arguing for a new modern idea of corporate governance, about protecting those who put the money into the company, those who own shares, but those who have other commitments to it as well. He founded the ideas that we'll look at later in other videos and other lectures, and he argued that the political system that had been set up to that point benefited speculators, and to benefit companies, This is something you will hear a lot about in the crash of 2008, so there's nothing new about it. We talk about back in 1929, the political system was owned by big business, and this led to FDR to try and break up the big corporations. FDR's strategy was one of antitrust laws because he was actually saying that the too big to fail argument crippled real capitalism. FDR was the president, Berle was in some ways his thinker. This argument is not anti-capitalist though. Rather than kill capitalism, in fact, he believed he was the one who could save capitalism from itself, to bring it back from the dead. So that is the political economy system that existed in Berle's time, in the fact that Berle believed in it. It was one that was set up for the benefit of companies, not for the benefit of entrepreneurs. So what conclusions have he said? Well, he believed that you had to think long term instead of short term if you wanted to build up results. If we want stability, requires this long-term stability, argue for the primacy of short-term returns, we will have problems, and the free market is naturally short-term. This is because if people are waiting over time for returns, somebody may come in and buy them out in the hope of making something short-term. Free market tend towards encouraging short-term stock holding, so they're not interested in running the companies. The people who buy the shares are not interested in running the companies. That is the key thing he's saying. They're not interested in it. They just want to basically buy the shares, hold them for a short period of time, and then sell them on again. In the crash of 2008, one that was very common around this neck of the woods, well, the York neck of the woods where I live, Northern Rock went down. Northern Rock was a building society that had become a bank, and people who owned Northern Rock shares were saying on television, who was looking after us? Who was monitoring the management people? Well, actually, the shareholders were meant to monitor the management people. But they were not seeing it as that. The role of a shareholder is to monitor management. It's one of the reasons that we'll look at in other videos, other lectures, as to why stockholders should receive dividends. And one of them is monitoring control of management. But shareholders were not interested in this. They were only interested in how much they could sell the shares for. So the connection is broken between the buying of stocks and the running of the company. Shareholders were not interested in this. This gave a lot of independence to company managers. In a later lecture on Chandler, he will see this as a good thing, because he believes managers are all good lads from the same universities, good honest background, honest, decent, semi-aristocratic stock, and they would always do the right thing. But actually, Berle is saying this was not true. These people were actually there only to help themselves, and it was only going to get worse. The idea was stockholders were passive, but they were protected, so effectively what was happening was stockholders were protected from their errors. But remember, this is back in the 20s, we're protecting stockholders, 30s. Now the stockholders in 2008 were practically pretty much wiped out. But the bankers, the people who ran the companies, the managers, were protected. So the idea was that actually the protection is now at the other side. But it is still not causing the economy to operate well. The idea of shareholding and stockholding making an entrepreneur, though, still exists to a great extent. In the States, an amazing number of people own a tiny number of shares and believe that this gives them a sort of personal attachment to capitalism, that they were some sort of entrepreneur, but in fact, they were speculating, they're buying on the secondary market. In conclusion, Berle argued, long-term returns ahead of short-term, planning up to 20 years in the future, whereas the free market is more short-term than that. The term investment is not appropriate, as the stockholders do not save, invest, but speculate. There's no connection between the buying of stock and the running of companies. Stockholders are supine and passive, but protected by administrative laws. The US attachment to stockholders as entrepreneurs is purely emotional and no longer has any basis in fact. So, what is Berle talking about when he says the death of capitalism? Okay, he's talking about the experience of the 20s and 30s, and you can see the 20s and 30s, they're actually saying stockholders are speculators. This is very controversial. Speculators caused the crash, but people tried to think of them being as the speculators being different from themselves who own shares. Okay, so he was pro-capitalist, but believed this speculation was undermining true capitalism. He believed that the visible hand, which we'll see when we talk about Chandler, as being positive, or being claimed to be positive, had been taken over from the invisible hand of the market, and this was actually causing grave problems for capitalism. Undermined that. He believed that speculation, not ownership, was what was now legally protected, and that market forces were no longer prevalent. In believing this, of course, he believed that risk was being moved over to others, that the people who actually were putting the money in were not taking the risk, but the risk was being put onto what we will see now as pension fund owners, small business owners, etc., small shareholders owners were taking the risk. And the big question is, who are the capitalists now? That is the big question that Berle created, the legacy of Berle. But of course, who are the capitalists is actually a question for another lecture. We'll have a lecture completely on who are the capitalists. So this is the legacy of Berle. But to really understand his work, this is a brief history of him, but you must actually read some of his work to really understand what we're getting at here. Reading is the most important part. The references are in the comments below this video.